Look, it's been my very great pleasure to be involved with the new textbook series, Cambridge Humanities for Victoria, for which I've written 3 chapters. As an author, I draw great energy and also inspiration from the prospect that a chapter can just absolutely intrigue and engage young minds. And if it makes life easier for teachers, most of us are desperately time poor, so much the better. Two of my chapters, one was Industrial Revolution, the other World War One. Wonderful topics, both of them, but ones that have been intensely covered in so many books. And there is a tendency to cover the same classic aspects of each. I felt that my task was to make sure that I did cover the canonical material, but also to enliven it by seeking out new sources and fresh, unusual viewpoints. The chapter on the First World War also demanded fresh perspectives. It was really important to cover the essential aspects of the conflict, such as the debate over the outbreak of the war, the technical details of the terrible new weapons developed. But I did want to explore less familiar aspects of the war, such as the enormous importance of women on the home front. And I wanted to look at the controversial issue of the Anzac myth or legend. By good fortune, I found myself travelling in England. My wife and son set off for the Doctor Who trail. I set off for the Imperial War Museum trail. And needless to say, the exhibition spaces were just astounding, but that wasn't what I came for. I needed to have access to the broadest and deepest collection of recent publications, hopefully containing fresh and stimulating insights into the World War. And I found them. One of the most fascinating primary sources I discovered here was also the most humble, the official postcard, printed by the British government to inject innocuous propaganda into thousands of British homes. This one, by its title, talks about the glorious 1st of July, our first prisoners. That is a gaggle of about a dozen German prisoners. It is an outrageous distortion because the date refers to the catastrophic first day of the Somme, Britain's most costly military defeat. Some 20,000 men were killed, mainly in the first hour, at a rate of 1 death every 4.4 seconds. This is where the tragedy of war and of propaganda bites home. My travels also brought me to the work of Jean-Michel Gerard, a French-Canadian artist who does wonderful images of military figures, and Cambridge, being Cambridge, tracked him down, employed him straight away, and has done splendid images for the whole series. This one is a stormtrooper, one of Germany's elite shock troops in World War One. Another important place for research and resources was in Paris, where Les Invalides houses not one, but 5 distinct museums of military history, one of them devoted to the World Wars. And here too, the museum craft was state of the art, but it wasn't really what I needed. It was again the bookshop. And from the bookshop, I came across one of the best analyses I've ever seen of images of propaganda, as it's called, the art of selling war. And I think as teachers, we know that the discussion of emotive wartime posters, including techniques such as the bestialization of the enemy, will allow very rich classroom discussion. No account of war, I think, is complete without the dimension of women's history. Images of nurses and of munitions workers are common enough, but they need to be linked with this staggering volume of work that women did. In Britain, for example, women were producing 80% of weapons by 1917. And it's less well known that some 200,000 women stepped up to the plate and kept the British government and administration running during the war. Here's a couple of pages from the chapter. On the left, you can see the photographs and the posters about women's munitions workers. And on the right, you have one of Gerard's beautiful drawn images of a nurse. And just to give you an idea of what those women worked at, here in Australia, they were working at Maribyrnong at the huge ammunition plant, and they were handling shells like this one, 4.5 inches in diameter, an absolute huge shell from a Navy gun, so heavy that even empty, I can barely carry it properly. And that's what the women were working with. One small lapse of concentration and there would be a huge explosion, which is in fact what happened at the Maribyrnong plant at one stage. I'd like to share with you one remarkable story, an inspiring story of an Australian painter, Dora Mason. Before the war, she was already a suffragette, and she went to Britain to advise the British suffragettes in their campaign on the vote. But she was a modernist painter, And so people at the time during the war were very mystified when she suddenly went backwards artistically to a more traditional style of painting. And she painted a sentimental scene of a British family farewelling a soldier. They were mystified, but there was a good reason for it. Mason was an artist, but she was also an activist and a feminist. She learned that British working women were not receiving government pensions when their husbands were killed. They were actually having to prostitute themselves just to feed their families. So she painted this work in the academic style, knowing it could be sold at a high price, and distributed all the money to needy women. There's a wonderful biography of Dora Mason by Myra Scott, just come out, inspiring reading. And there on the right is the painting we're talking about. On the left, you can see that instead of just putting a caption on the work, I try to build learning exercises around images so they become a text to be interpreted, not just a picture. One important aspect for me was to give historians and the work they do presence on the page. I wanted students to realise that historians are people and professionals, not just names on the covers of books. And one I chose was the great Bill Gammage, whose work I absolutely worship, to illustrate the importance of primary sources. So there is a little collage with a soldier in the trenches writing a postcard home or a letter home. That's a primary source. And then Bill Gammage in his study writing up his wonderful book, The Broken Years. It is a comfort to me to know that somebody else has got a study as untidy as I do. And finally, I was very intrigued that our course of study asks us to engage with current debates about the issue of commemoration of war. I stole the title of the controversial book by Lake and Reynolds, two historians I respect massively. They wrote the book, What's Wrong with Anzac? And I put my own title there. And I believe that this part of the course could really stimulate some absolutely fascinating class discussions about whether commemoration is glorification of war or whether it is a respectful appreciation of service.